the history of Holcombe started with the Chief Justice in Queen Elizabeth's reign, who was called Edward Cook, and he lived at Tettershaw, and one of his many children, one of his sons, married a Miss Wheatley who owned property at Holcombe. I'm talking about the 1500s, and the son eventually came to live in a small house called Hill Hall, which was sited at Holcombe, and it was only when his descendant, the first Earl of Leicester, came into the property and went to Italy for the grand tour that he became interested in art and collecting pictures, and he came back to England, having been in Italy for 4 years from the age of 16, to build Holcombe, which he did. It took him 30 years to build, and he was rather disappointed as his only son became a hopeless, dissolute man who married and had no children. He then went to the original Lord Leicester's great-nephew, who became the famous Cook of Norfolk, and he did a lot for agriculture in Norfolk and was rather a famous man.
So who was Cook of Norfolk?
Cook of Norfolk was the nephew of the first Lord Leicester. So when he inherited it, he did not call himself Lord Leicester because he had no right to it. He inherited it through his grandmother, who was a niece of the original Earl of Leicester.
So he was your great-grandfather? Great-great-grandfather?
Cook of Norfolk was my great-great-grandfather, and eventually my father inherited. He was the direct successor to Cook of Norfolk.
So when would your father have inherited? What sort of year do you think that was?
Sorry?
When was it that your father inherited?
My father inherited in 1943, but my grandfather lived to be 93. And so my father and mother still lived down in Hampshire, at Sowley, near Lymington. And they only came to Holcombe in 1943 as owners, although we had been there a lot, to stay with the grandparents.
And what do you remember of Holcombe when you came to stay as a child with your grandfather?
All the children used to have the chapel wing, which was quite apart, and we had one big room downstairs, which was the day nursery. And my cousins, David, not my cousin, my cousin Diana and Tony had one room at the top of the house, and Tommy and I had the other. In the 1920s, my little sister was only a baby. She was born in 1920. And so the cousins were my brother and myself, and David and Tony, who used to have games, and our great fun was playing robbers in the corridors and running about in the dark.
So what about all the servants that were there at that time? What kind of servants do you remember?
There was a housekeeper and a butler, 2 footmen, a pantry boy, and Chris, who was a wonderful odd-job man who did everything, as well as several housemaids, still-room maids, head cook and kitchen maid.
Did you talk to them much? Did you have much to do with them?
Of course, we had our nannies and nursery maids, and Ethel was a great favourite because she was the still-room maid and used to give us cakes and sweets when we called on her in the still-room. And we always went to prayers every morning. My grandfather used to read prayers at 9 o'clock. I didn't understand them very well because he used to gabble, and we all thought that his mind was on his breakfast, which was to come.
And what kind of breakfast did you sit down to at that time?
An enormous breakfast. Grandpa used to have fish. There was either fish or eggs and cereal to begin with, scones, marmalade and jam. My grandfather invariably ended his large meal with a boiled egg, which he cooked himself on a plated egg boiler, exactly timed for 3 minutes. He then poured cream on top of the egg, after which he ended with some scones and fruit. There were at least 8 baskets of different fruit on the table. The head gardener, Mr. Patterson, was very famous for his vegetables and fruit, including melons and grapes, etc.
So you must have been absolutely stuffed after breakfast. I'm surprised you could all move.
I don't think we ate as much as my grandfather did. Of course, we didn't have such grand meals in the nursery, but it was quite adequate. And it was only when we grew up, I was 18, that we were allowed to eat with the grown-ups in the dining room. And that was rather a terrifying ordeal for a young girl when I had to make conversation to one's elderly neighbour during 6 courses. It was considered rude not to talk, and Grandpa occasionally made very cutting remarks to any young person sitting silent, such as, "Have you lost your tongue?"
And were you quite shy, or were you very sociable? Or
I was quite shy to begin with, but I suppose one got used to it, and one had to make conversation.
what did you talk about? Can you remember? What sort of things? What would you have said to them?
I suppose we talked about the weather, as usual, and what we had done the day before. Grandpa's question used to be always, "What have you been up to?" And we had to invent something, whether we had done anything or not, but it was usually just going down to the beach and getting cockles or swimming.
Do you think the beach has changed much at Holcombe nowadays compared to how you remember it?
No, the actual surroundings have changed a bit, because during the war there was a tank trap all round by the pine needles, and that stopped the wind encroaching on the sand dunes, and the sand dunes have gone further and further towards the sea. And except for the amount of people coming down the main road, which in those days was private, I think the beach is still a lovely place to play, with lots of space and a beautiful surrounding.